And Edda asked me to preach about an ancient promise, and I was spoilt for choice. Back the way, that's it, yeah. Spoilt for choice in terms of the promises that were given about the coming of the Messiah, the Lord Jesus Christ. And so I decided in the end to think about the first promise, which was in the Garden of Eden. The promise was that the Messiah would come and he would crush the head of Satan, and he would crush the head of death and bring life to the world, in response to the fall of humankind. And the final one chronologically would be, he will come again from the clouds of heaven as the Son of Man. And so I thought I would land on John chapter 14 as Jesus is actually preparing his disciples for his departure. And the problem that they have is the imminent departure of Jesus. He says, do not let your hearts be troubled. So they have heart trouble because of the imminent departure of this Messiah that they've been following for 3 years. And of course, for 3 years, he's hinted at the fact that he's going to be taken from them. He's going to die. But they couldn't quite work out what that all meant. And even after the resurrection, when he was about to ascend to the right hand of the Father, he had been raised from the dead, but still they'd be thinking, how does this all work? How do we do this? And of course, they wouldn't understand the implications of the coming of the Spirit into the world and into their hearts. So I thought I would take those two promises, because you could be spoilt for choice as to which promise to look for. And Jesus has hinted, but right now in the upper room discourse, which is 13 to 17 of John, where he's preparing his disciples for his departure. In John chapter 13, he unequivocally states what's about to happen. He says, my children, I will be with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and just as I told the Jews, so I tell you, where I am going, you cannot come. So if the cause of their heart trouble is the absence of Jesus, then the cure is the comings of Jesus. And I mean that, comings, because he talks in this passage about his coming in the person of the Spirit. In verse 18, he says, I will not leave you as orphans, I will come to you. So he will come in the person of the Spirit. But ultimately, in the fulfillment of the Daniel prophecy, he will come again at the end of the age. And in verse 28, he hints at that, or he states it. He says, I'm going away and I'm coming back to you. I have told you now before it happens, so that when it does happen, you will believe. And so, understandably, they're wondering what's about to happen in the face of death. And your series is Life Through Death. And so we're all faced with that. We all have an uncertainty about how what it will feel like, going through the process of dying. We may be confident about where we're going because we're trusting in Jesus, but the process of dying might be an uncertainty. But these disciples, no doubt, had a lot of confusion as to what was going to happen over these next few days and weeks. And ultimately, as I say, the coming of the Spirit entered into them, and they then transformed the world. But we all have those questions, and humankind have this fear of death. I was reading an interview with Sting in Rolling Stone magazine, and he was talking about, this was some years ago, he was talking about how he was coming to terms with his own mortality. He's worth something like £400,000, 500,000, £500 million. And he was performing in Australia in front of about 100,000 people. But he said that at that time, he was being confronted with the death of all of these rock icons. And he said he became like a child, saying, no, that one can't go. And Prince had died, and Lemmy, his good friend, had died, Leonard Cohen, Lou Reed. All of these guys were dying. And Sting was saying, no, he can't die. No, he can't die. And he said he realized that he had more days behind him than ahead of him. And after each gig in Australia, he didn't stay for the after-gig party. He went straight back to his hotel room and sat there thinking, what is life and death all about? How can this work? With all of his platinum discs around his walls and all of his houses throughout the world and his fame and his fortune, he was confronted with death and he was saying, how does this work? And so even though he was rich and is rich, phenomenally so, he's not as rich as any one of us if we are trusting in Jesus. Because we have riches beyond his imagination because Jesus has gone to prepare a place for us. And in this passage, Jesus is preparing his disciples in that way. And interestingly, Jesus describes himself in 4 different ways in this passage. The first way in which he describes himself is he is the forerunner. Look at verse 2. In my Father's house are many rooms. I am going there to prepare a place for you. This isn't just a hint. This is saying, I am going to deal with death, but ultimately there will be life forevermore. I'm going to prepare a place for you in heaven. Jesus has gone ahead of us. Hebrews chapter 10 uses the term forerunner as I have used it there. The writer to the Hebrews actually says, our anchor of hope is fastened secure in heaven where Jesus, our forerunner, has gone in before us. And so Jesus is our forerunner. He goes ahead of us. We are uncertain. We are not sure when we're going to die, what it will be like, but we are assured that Jesus, our forerunner, has gone ahead of us. And he uses the Greek word in Hebrews chapter 6. He uses the word prodromoi, which is a Greek word which was used by a crack unit. It wasn't just this, but this is the name that was given to a crack unit in the Roman army. And this unit used to go ahead of the main army and check for enemies and check that the way ahead was clear and remove any obstacles so that when the main army came through, it was going to be clear. And what Jesus is saying is, I am your forerunner. I'm going ahead of you to prepare a place for you. And he says, in my Father's house are many rooms. In King James it says many mansions. The basic idea is spaciousness and refreshment. That's the emphasis that Jesus is giving there. And so there are lots of experiences that we have in this life that give us a sense of peace and a sense of coming home. It may be your actual literal home. When you go there at night, you can just relax and put your feet up and watch the television or whatever. There's a sense of peace and a breathing a sigh of relief after a heavy day. There may be relationships that you have that the minute you see that person and speak to them again, you kind of relax into it. There may be experiences that you've had, places that you've gone to, places where you go for a walk and it's almost as if there's a breath of sigh of relief there. And Jesus is saying the rooms, the places, and he says many, it literally means many different kinds. He means that there's room for everyone. And God elsewhere it states he is not willing that any should perish. So he wants all of us to join him in heaven. And Jesus has gone ahead to prepare a place for us. C.S. Lewis says, our Father refreshes us on the journey with some pleasant inns, but will not encourage us to mistake them for home. In other words, yes, we can experience peace, and yes, we can experience places in this life that are an anticipation of heaven, but they ain't home yet, because we're not home yet. And therefore, death is not a leap into the great unknown, but it's a journey to a prepared place. It will not be like arriving in a strange city in a foreign land where we know nobody, but we're going home. I remember when I think it was about 17, 4 of us at school decided to go hitchhiking in Europe for the summer. And we went to, Germany, Italy, France, Switzerland, all over the place. And we were told that if you wear kilts, you get really good lifts. Some of them were dodgy lifts, but we went, we got good lifts. And what we used to do each morning when we set off hitchhiking was we would start in two pairs. And we would stand on the outskirts of a city with our thumbs out. And if we were there for an hour or a couple of hours without a lift, we would then split up into separate, we would each individually start hitching. And usually what we would say was, look, we'll meet up again in Paris at the youth hostel. We'll meet up again in Rome. And so we would see each other, hopefully that night. Sometimes if you didn't get there in time, you'd sleep underneath a hedge or whatever. But ultimately you would get to this city that you did not know. And I remember going into Marseille one night, dark, late at night, and all these dodgy characters. And here was me with my rucksack and my kilt on. And I thought to myself, this is not a good idea. But what I do remember, when I went into Strasbourg, the youth hostel there on the lawn was my best friend. He was the guy that led me to Christ. There he was with a long drink, aviator sunglasses, shorts on, and just enjoying the sun. I thought, yes, I've come to the right place. Now, when we get to heaven, it's not like some unknown, strange place. When we get there, and C.S. Lewis says this, I keep quoting C.S. Lewis, but the guy's brilliant. And he says, when I get to heaven, I'll stop and say, of course. In other words, all of those experiences that we have in there that makes us almost think there must be something more. And for us as Christians, we know that there is something more. Then we're going out. And Jesus says, I have gone there to prepare a place for us. He's the forerunner. But Jesus speaks also of him being the escort. I will come back and take you to be with me, that you also may be where I am. I will come back and take you to be with me. In the conquering of death, this is Jesus coming to take us to that place where life will never end. And it's a primary reference to him returning in glory. And when the ascension happened, remember the disciples were looking up into heaven, thinking, how does this work? And the angel said to them, men of Galilee, why do you stand here looking into the sky? This same Jesus will come back in the same way you have seen him go into heaven. And Revelation tells us, look, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him. So yes, he's gone to prepare a place for us, but he comes back to escort us there as he returns in glory. But the secondary reference is as he returns for us each as believers, individually. Because if we ain't here when Jesus comes back, we certainly will be here when he comes back for us. On that day when you breathe your last, Jesus will come alongside and say, look, we're going to make this trip together. I'm here for you. So the secondary reference, and if you fear that experience, if you've ever been with someone as they've breathed their last, or if you have a fear in some way of death as to what that's going to be like, Jesus promises, I will come back and take you to be with me forever. He will come as our escort, not just our forerunner, preparing the way, but coming back to take us to be with him in glory. Alexander MacLaren, the well-known Scottish preacher, when he was a young man, he started his first job. He was living in Glasgow, or he lived on the outskirts of Glasgow, and he got this job, and it was his first day at work. And there was a path that he took back to his house that went through a dark place. I think there was trees around, and there was a dip. There was almost a wee ravine. And he was scared of that part of the path, but he knew he had to walk back after his first day at work in the dark back to his house. And so he came to this part of the pathway and part of the road, and he heard footsteps behind him. And he thought, oh my goodness me, but like Michael Jackson's Thriller video, what's going to happen? Who's behind me? So he started walking a bit faster, and those footsteps went faster. And eventually he stopped, and he looked round, and he said this, up out of the darkness and into the pale light, as I watched, came the head and the shoulders of the greatest man on earth. It was his father. He was bound to have known I was scared, but he only said, Alex, I wanted to see you so badly that I came to meet you. Then McLaren says this, so shoulder to shoulder, we went down into the valley, and I was not afraid of anything that walked. Why? Because his father had come to escort him home. And at that point, when we enter into the darkest valley we will ever face, the valley of deep darkness, there will come Jesus, and we'll feel him taking our hand or taking our arm or even carrying us and saying, right, okay, here we go. We're going home. He's our forerunner. He's our escort. But interestingly, he's our destination, that you also may be where I am. Well, if he is the Lord of life and death, if he holds the keys of death and Hades, if he is the one who has all authority, then surely he must be the one who is also the destination, not just the forerunner, not just the escort, but the destination. He comes to us himself, and he takes us to be with him, because he is the most important person as we enter into glory and live there forever. You likely know the story of Stephen, the first martyr, in Acts chapter 7. We read, Stephen looked up to heaven and saw the glory of God, and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. In other words, he looked to heaven and he didn't see a golden city. He didn't see streets of gold. He didn't see jewels and emeralds and angels and so on. What he saw, which was most important, was he saw Jesus standing at the right hand of God. The interesting thing is that the Bible tells us that when Jesus went to heaven, he sat down at the right hand of the Father. And that was a symbol of him having finished his work on earth. He'd come, he'd lived for 30 years, he had taught for 3 years, he'd gone to the cross, he died, he'd been raised from the dead, he ascended to the right hand of the Father, he poured his Spirit upon the church, he sat down at the right hand of the Father. And many commentators, and I don't think it's fanciful to say this, many commentators say that Stephen saw him standing at the right hand of the Father because Jesus was standing to welcome the first martyr into glory. I dare to believe, whether he's sitting or standing, I'll be happy to see Jesus. I don't know what you think of when you think of heaven. I often ask myself, what will it be like? And yes, the most important person there is Jesus. But for me, it's not going to be floating around in nighties all the time. And much as I enjoy going to church and singing hymns, dare I say it, and I hope you won't stone me as a result of this, but I don't want to be singing hymns for eternity either. To me, it will be a full-orbed life. It will be absolute, a new heavens and a new earth. And it's not going to be some ethereal, ghostly place. It will be, if anything, more solid than this life. And we will go on growing. If it's static and we're perfect and we never grow and we never learn anything more, that's going to be pretty boring. But if God is eternal, we will spend eternity plumbing the depths of his love. And dare I say, and you might think this is too flippant, but Tony Campolo, who is often quite flippant, argues that there will be an Italian quarter in heaven where you can go to get a pizza. Now, that might sound crazy, but actually there are bits that in Revelation where it talks about the kings of the earth bringing their riches. And there is the argument that it's the best of the cultures of the world that will be redeemed. Not just individuals, but our Scottishness, our Italianness, or whatever nation you come from will have its own expression in heaven. It will be redeemed. And so I'm looking forward to growing in lots of different skills that I don't have now, that I wish I had time to do, or I've tried and I've failed at. I will have all of eternity to explore that and to learn from that. Not just sing, I'm sure we will sing hymns from time to time, and I'm sure we won't wear nighties, but I'm sure there'll be all sorts of things that you will explore. But let me get back to this passage. What is the most important thing? You will see the face of Jesus. And I think, actually, we might well bow at his feet when we see the wounds in his hands and his side. I think some of the ugliest things in your life may become things of beauty in glory. Yeah, maybe your scars will be healed and there will be no sign of them. But maybe some of them you'll be quite proud of. Did I ever tell you how I got this scar? And you'll be boring us with it when we have coffee in heaven or when we go to Pizza Land, whatever it is. Did I ever tell? Because you're proud of it, because Jesus got you through that dark time. You thought you weren't going to get through. You thought you were going to throw in the towel. You thought your faith was at an end. But that scar reminds you of how Jesus got you through. And I think when we see Jesus, we will bow at his feet and say, Lord and my God, just as Thomas did as he knelt before the feet of Jesus. And I think C.S. Lewis, again, 3 times in one sermon, I'll probably get another 2 as well, but C.S. Lewis hints at this at the end of the Narnia books, when the children have been killed in a train crash and now they're going to the real place, and he says all their life in this world and all their adventures had only been the cover and the title page. Now at last they were beginning chapter 1 of the great story which no one on earth has read, which goes on forever, in which every chapter is better than the one before. D.L. Moody, when he was dying on his deathbed, said, "Is this dying? Why, this is bliss. There is no valley. I have been within the gates. Earth is receding. Heaven is opening. God is calling. I must go." And Jesus is there. He is our destination. He is our home. There's a story, and I think it's a true story, about an old missionary couple who had been serving God in Africa, preaching the gospel for virtually all of their life. And they were traveling back by ship, and they lived in New York, and they were on this ship. And President Teddy Roosevelt and his assistants and a whole group were on the same ship. And as they came into New York Harbor, they saw this band and this reception, and people cheering, banners and everything for the president. And they thought, I hope someone comes to meet us. I hope we've been remembered. And they go down the gangplank looking for anyone from their church, anyone that they know, carrying their wee suitcases, tattered suitcases that had served them all these years. They saw no one. And the man became upset, and he became bitter and angry. And they went to their wee apartment where they were retiring to. And he was going on and on. I mean, when you get to our age, you become grumpy old. I'm grumbling about just about everything. My wife gets sick of it. That's our little secret, so don't tell her. And those of you on the internet, it's our little secret. Okay. But this guy was grumbling, and his wife eventually said, because wives are good for this, she said, for goodness sake, get into that room and get it sorted out with God. So he went there. He came back out of after an hour. And his face was radiant. And she said, "Did God say something? Did God speak to you?" And he said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, what did he say?" He said, "You're not home yet." And that's what it's going to be like. We'll get that when we get home. Jesus will be there. He will be our destination. And there's one last way in which Jesus speaks. And that is, he talks about himself as the way. Jesus says, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father." Thanks a lot, that's great. "No one comes to the Father except through me." Paul speaks in Ephesians chapter 1 about the Spirit, the Holy Spirit that we all have as Christians, being a seal. It's almost as if it's the seal of what is ultimately going to happen to us. The Spirit's seal upon us means that God has already purchased us and that he guarantees to bring us to himself. So when Jesus started speaking to the disciples in John chapter 14, he says, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid." He is the way to God. And for those of you who worry about people not hearing about Jesus, maybe your loved ones, we don't know what they have heard and what they believe before they die. There's a wonderful book called Eternity in Their Hearts by Don Richardson, who's an anthropologist and a missionary, and he gives example after example after example of people groups that they discover throughout the world that when missionaries go and tell them the gospel story, they say, "We knew. We had holy men centuries ago who told us the story because God had appeared to them in dreams." Some of them had names of people in the Bible like Noah and Adam and Eve, and they believed. Helen Keller, the deaf, dumb and blind girl, when they finally got through to her and explained the story of Jesus and God, she said, "Yes, I knew." You see, Jesus is the way, but he's not limited by us in terms of reaching out to people who have not yet heard. He's the forerunner. He's the escort. He's the destination. And he's the way. There was a 19th century clergyman, John Todd, who, when he was 6 years old, his parents were killed. And an old aunt took him in and became virtually his surrogate mother. And he then went into the ministry, and this aunt wrote to him one day, because sometimes when you get older, maybe the solid truths that you believed once, they can seem a bit more hazy. Your assurance can sometimes... I've known of older people, perhaps it's dementia, perhaps it's the shaking of their mind and the things that were solid. And that's what was happening to this woman. And she said, "I'm not sure. How can I be sure?" And he wrote this letter to her. "It's now 35 years since I, as a boy of 6, was left quite alone in the world. You sent me word you would give me a home and be a kind mother to me. I've never forgotten the day I made the long journey to your house. I can still recall my disappointment when, instead of coming for me yourself, you sent your servant to fetch me. I remember my tears and anxiety as, perched high on your horse and clinging tight to Caesar, I rode off to my new home. Night fell before we finished the journey, and I became lonely and afraid. Do you think she'll go to bed before we get there?" I asked Caesar. "Oh no," he said reassuringly. "She'll stay up for you. When we get out of these woods, you'll see her candle shining in the window." Presently, we did ride out into the clearing, and there, sure enough, was your candle. I remember you were waiting at the door, that you put your arms close about me, a tired and bewildered little boy. You had a fire burning on the hearth, hot supper waiting on the stove, and after supper you took me to my new room, heard me say my prayers, and then sat beside me till I fell asleep. Then he said this, "Someday soon God will send for you to take you to a new home. Don't fear the summons, the strange journey, or the messenger of death. God can be trusted to do as much for you as you were kind enough to do for me so many years ago. At the end of the road, you will find love and a welcome awaiting, and you will be safe in God's care." He will take us home. Why? Because he's the forerunner, he's the escort, he's the destination, and he's the way.